stage and they have to have some surgery. A 2008 study of 9,000 nursing homes found that African American nursing home residents were more likely than Caucasian residents to be hospitalized for dehydration, poor nutrition, bed sores, and other ailments because of a gap in the quality of medical care that they received in nursing homes. So why do we have this continuation of racial disparities in healthcare? Some argue that it's because we have social determinants. The fact that people don't have a great education, the fact that there's a difference in socioeconomic status. And we can talk about that during the question and answer period. What I suggest is that even when you look outward at those factors are tied to race. As you saw when I had the slides up, you still have an issue when it comes to getting jobs. I think it's already been discussed about if you see a name on a resume, depending on what race you think it is, it's been shown if it's traditionally an African American name, you'll be less likely to get hired. And so those social determinants of health do feed into the healthcare system correctly in causing racial disparities, but those social determinants of health are also linked to racial bias. When you get within the healthcare system, you see implicit bias. And there's been a whole host of studies about this within the healthcare field and outside. The first one was a 1999 Shulman study that found that African Americans were less likely to be referred for cardiac catheterization than Caucasians, while African American women were significantly less likely to be referred for treatment. And in this study, he didn't even go into why it was happening, but there was a lot of backlash on this study. In 2000 and 2006, and here, this is when you begin to get the understanding of why some of this racial disparities continue. They did research which showed that physicians rated African American patients as less intelligent, less educated, and more likely to fail to comply with physicians' medical advice, even when the information that the patient gave them contradicted these beliefs. So if I had walked into a physician's office dressed as I am, talked about that I was a law professor in case, that even then some of these physicians would still believe that I was less intelligent, that I was less educated, and less likely to comply with their recommendations. Other studies have shown that they also hold the belief that African American patients are more likely to use drugs. So if you take a step back and actually think about this, do you think that if you walk into a physician's office and you need some treatment, perhaps antibiotics, that they're actually going to give it to you? Probably not. If they hold these biases. I think what was really interesting was Robert's slide about pain, because there's lots of evidence in the medical literature that African Americans are undertreated when it comes to pain relief. And perhaps that is why, because when we look at it and when we hear it, we don't really listen. And even though I'm talking about this in race, it holds true for gender, it holds true for socioeconomic status as well. I just want to talk a little bit about nursing home treatment. There have been a lot of studies on nursing homes as well and race. Particularly in 1984, there was a New York study that showed that nursing homes, which provided excellent quality of care, demonstrated a pattern of admitting Caucasians over African Americans. They redid that study 8 years later in 1992, and they found that that was still the case, that there were nursing homes were 3 times more likely, quality nursing homes were 3 times more likely to admit Caucasians than they were African Americans. And of course, there's always an Ohio case to serve as an example for us. There was a case here in the 1990s where the housing department actually went in and sent testers to see if this nursing home perhaps was discriminating based on race. And what they found was they were discriminating against race. But you know what? The nursing home was not found guilty. And let me give you the evidence. They sent one black person in there to get a bed for their uncle. They were going to pay out of their pocket, which I don't know about you, but in a healthcare system, that's yes, we take that person. Okay? Doesn't matter if they're crawling, if they're yelling, you're going to pay out of your pocket, we're going to take that person. Okay? And that person who went in was African American. She asked, was there a bed? They told her no. You have to get on a wait list. She walks out. White person walks in, says, my uncle needs a bed. They're part Medicare. And you know what that person was told? Sure, we have a bed available for you. It's not as if it was a day. They passed each other, okay? But the nursing home was still found not guilty in terms of racial discrimination. So, what are some of the solutions? Some of the solutions, and you can see in the work, particularly in the criminal justice system, they talk about that we need to explicitly acknowledge our bias. Okay, I've really skimmed through. There's a lot of information out there. There's a term called aversive racism, where in fact you believe that you're progressive, but your actions so differently that you have implicit bias. Okay, and this goes to that as well as all of us who have implicit bias, that we need to explicitly acknowledge that racial bias remains in the healthcare system. In 2002, there was an Institute of Medicine study that is titled Unequal Healthcare, Unequal Treatment. In that study, they talk about this implicit bias. But since then, all the way through healthcare reform, all of a sudden racial bias does not matter. I don't know what happened. I was alive then. I think everybody here was alive then. I didn't see a major event happening in 2002 that changed it for everybody moving forward to 2013. So we need to explicitly acknowledge that racial bias remains. We don't necessarily have to just punish people, but we can also educate people. In a couple of weeks, I am speaking at the medical school, and I want to talk about the fact that we all hold our implicit bias. But the key to really addressing this, particularly in terms of racial disparities, is that it can't be pointing fingers at it's just you, it's not me. It has to be more about what do I need to do? When I see a person come into my classroom, when I see a person walking down the street, how do I feel, right? Acknowledge that, address it, okay? Not necessarily punish it, but it's also in terms of the healthcare field, we not only fail to recognize it in ourselves and how we treat and how we have a relationship with our patients, but we also fail to understand how it affects people's health. When you look at infant mortality, and I'm going to stop after this, when you look at infant mortality, there's always discussions about, oh, well, we have an increase in infant mortality for African Americans versus Caucasians, perhaps because they don't eat enough, perhaps because they use drugs, perhaps because biologically African Americans are different. But we fail to actually acknowledge is that stress is a major factor when it comes to infant mortality. And don't you think that you would be stressed if you woke up every morning and you had to experience racial hatred? Don't you think that you would be stressed if you woke up every morning and you were getting sexually harassed at your job? Don't you think that you would be stressed if you were discriminated against in any form? But we never take that into consideration when we talk about disparities. We try to focus on biology, and what I suggest is that in talking about explicitly acknowledging racial bias, we need to talk about how we interact, but how it also leads to poor health status for everyone involved. And so, with that, I will end with the quote that I started with. I can never be who I ought to be until you are who you ought to be. If we can never set down this belief that other people are others and not full human beings, then we will never altogether be the nation that we can be. So I thank you for coming, and I'd like to open up it up for questions. Thank you. Yes, Tim.
Thanks for your panel covering death, health, history, and everything between. A lot of you talked about implicit bias, and I was wondering, and I think that's helpful for some of us who aren't quite as familiar with that concept. To what extent is, and you focus on images, I want to look at the actual observers themselves. To what extent is implicit bias present, or having you look at the issue from a white or black perspective? So, in other words, do whites have a higher implicit bias than blacks do? What is the evidence tell us about that?
Yeah, whites have a higher level of implicit pro-white anti-black bias than blacks. In the black community, if you look at the graph, it's actually it's interesting. There maybe 30% will have a pro-black bias, 35% will have a pro-white bias, and the rest will have no bias. So you see it's quite a different picture. In the implicit bias context, generally, sometimes we have members of stereotype groups who hold greater percentages of biases, not in the black-white context. For example, women hold anti-female implicit biases at a pretty high level. So, for example, if you test on the association between female and family and home versus male in the workplace, a large number of women do hold those implicit biases as well. But at least in the black-white context, it's not as bad in terms of the numbers.
Other questions? Yeah.
We're here commemorating the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington. Statistics and information presented by all of the panelists does not really give us cause for celebration right now. And I was going to ask Justin, you mentioned your last slide, you only put it up there for that millisecond that I wasn't able to read it, the de-bias efforts, and I was wondering if you could tell us some more about those to give us a little bit more hope walking out.
Okay, yeah, I'll try to give you some hope. But first, the bad news. For a long time, people have been trying to quote de-bias. So if you look in the corporate world, there are a lot of consulting firms that offer things like diversity training that are marketed to help reduce bias in the workplace. The empirical evidence on that is not particularly helpful. So you can't assume that any de-biasing effort, even informing people about implicit bias by itself, is going to help. And in some cases, these things can actually backfire. However, in recent years, we have the social science emerging in terms of how do we de-bias. So some of the concepts that we found help, for example, seeing people in counter-stereotypical positions. So one of the better studies was done on female science and math professors. So women in those classes, college-level classes, if you track women who have male math and science professors compared to women who have female math and science professors, those female professors actually serve as de-biasing agents over a long period of time. So the simple concept of seeing people in counter-stereotypical roles is really important to understand as a de-biasing agent. Unfortunately, because of concepts like stereotype threat, which we didn't really talk about, getting people into counter-stereotype roles is not that easy. So it's not like, okay, we can just do this tomorrow. However, even techniques like recognizing our own stereotypic assumptions, really important. So for example, if a tall black man walks into the room and you think
As he walks into the room.
He's getting taller. I was going to say basketball player, but if you think basketball player, what should happen is you should catch yourself and say, why did I just think basketball player? Recognize that that's a stereotypic assumption. Identify it as such. And then there's further, so that by itself is helpful, but then there are further steps you can take. So individuation we call it. So actually seek out information about that person, even if you wouldn't otherwise do it. And by doing that, you will learn that your stereotypic assumption, whether or not it's true, is far from a defining feature of that person. If it turns out that's a basketball player, so what? Because you just learned who this person really is, right? And you realize that that's not a major part of how you should be thinking about it. So individuation is important, but even creating mental counter stereotypes can help. So, for example, even if you can't individuate, you recognize that was a stereotypic assumption. I'm going to think of this person, as a neuroscientist, or right. So, some area that would be a counter stereotype, or in the medical field, right? Nursing is like a gender stereotype role. So, so you can use it not just with racial things. So there have been programs, just in the last year, there's a program that researchers at University of Wisconsin have worked on, and they have shown that if you teach people techniques like those, you give them 5 techniques, you teach them how to do it, you present to them, they use about an hour and a half presentation, and you have people take implicit association tests. Then you give them these 5 techniques, and you check back with them like once every couple of weeks with a reminder email. You have them keep a journal of their experiences. That significantly reduced implicit bias levels 8 weeks later. And so I'm doing some work with them now. We're actually this next week we're going to be going to Massachusetts to train teachers, and we're going to test whether the intervention works on half of the teachers are going to be randomly assigned to the treatment condition, and half are going to wait and get it later, and we're going to measure to see how well it works. So it's new, but we have the basis now to have hope. It's not going to solve the problem, don't think it will, but it can help.
I think another thing that's interesting, so one method is sort of going after the biases directly. Another method sort of more, less technical, I guess. Ben talked about how a lot of juries are sort of all white. We know for a long time that's a bad idea, right? We want to have more diverse juries because people should have the right to serve. But there's a lot of evidence that actually the presence of Black Americans on juries changes the decision making, not of the Black Americans, but of the white Americans. So the white Americans consider evidence more carefully. They sort of are more receptive to alternative points of view. There's other research that shows that like explicitly talking about race, bring up the salience of race and not leaving it in the background is helpful during deliberations. And so just sort of recommitting ourselves to how carefully we're making sure that juries are diverse. We talked yesterday with a federal judge in Iowa who normally in non-capital cases, you just see such a small glimpse of people's lives, especially before you're sentencing them. Roughly 95% of people in the state felony system plead out, right? And so when they're sentenced, the first time they see the judges, sometimes in federal court, the real judge who sentences them is when they're being sentenced. It's the first time they'll ever meet. And the judges don't know very much. And so this judge in Iowa purposely gets a bunch of information about the individual themselves. And so you think about favoritism, we might just assume sort of good things about the white defendants, even without thinking about it, and assume bad things about the Black defendants. When we actually we take a second and get information not about the crime but about the person, it helps to sort of make that person an individual and give the judge a little bit more information. So I think, and the final thing is there's a law professor, Song Richardson, who suggested in the stop and frisk context, right? A lot of police departments gauge how successful their officers are by the number of arrests they make or the number of stops they make, right? But it turns out, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the stop and frisk litigation in New York City. It turns out that police officers just are really bad at figuring out when they stop people whether they actually have contraband, they have drugs. Whether you're white or black, you're wrong. The police are wrong about 90% of the time, right? But they're wrong even more when they pull over African Americans. So the number of times they pull them over to versus the number of times they have drugs, significantly less impressive, right? And so Sam Richardson has suggested that one thing you might do, which isn't directly going after the biases, but one thing you might do is tie, rather than to how many arrests you have, tie the officer's promotions to hit rate, how many times you successfully stop somebody, or how many times you found drugs, which might sort of have the indirect effect of stopping these negative outcomes.
And I would say, go ahead, Ben, did you want?
No.
I would say, to me, there is much to be proud of. But you can be proud, but know there's still work to do. I watched the march, it was 4.5 hours, and I was impressed. We have come a long way. I can sit up here, in case as the first ever tenured African American woman and say, but for that march, I would not be here. And yes, it took to 2011, but I am here. So there is much to be proud of, but I guess what I want to say to you as you guys leave, that there is much work to do. And it's not just, I just want to make it clear, it's not just about race, it's about equality for all. And it comes through the vote, it comes through jobs, it comes through equality. And so when you leave, that's what I want you to think about. I'm putting a challenge to you. A lot of you are my students in contracts. I'm challenging you to think about how you can take the next step. Was there a question up here?
I had a quick question building on just combating implicit biases. I was wondering if you found a reduction in implicit biases for people that take the test maybe a second time. I think that, it's one thing to see the graph, and once you actually do it yourself and find that if you yourself had it, if the second time you took it, there was a reduction in it.
One interesting thing is the way people react to taking the test. So we would hope that people who take the test and receive feedback that they have strong biases would accept that. And I always assign it to my students in my seminar classes, and I talk to them about it. And unfortunately, the range of reactions is strong. So I have them take multiple tests. The people who are most likely to become quote de-biased or to lessen their implicit bias levels are those who are found to be internally motivated for change. So people you can categorize people as internally motivated to be egalitarian or externally motivated. Externally motivated people are those who recognize that in our society it's not valued to be racist, and therefore they don't want to be racist or sexist. Right? Internally motivated people are those who reflect upon what that means. But that's the real key. It's not, certainly taking it more times leads to more understanding of it, but that's not the key. It's really internal motivation.
Several years before the Brown decision was issued in 1954, of psychologists conducted the doll studies. You may have heard of it. They would have a set of black dolls instead of white dolls. Not nearly as sophisticated as the studies that they're doing now, but basically they would ask white students which was a good doll, which was a nice doll, which was a pretty doll. They would always pick the white doll. And they would ask the black students the same thing. And they would then ask which doll looks most like you. And they've already identified the white doll as a pretty doll, white doll is a good doll, and they would be in effect saying that they were bad because they identified more with the black doll. This study was replicated a few years ago, and they concluded that there was some change, but there was not significant change, the change we would have expected 60 years after the doll study was conducted. So, that study could be done right here. If we had a group of white dolls and a group of black dolls, which is a pretty doll, which is a nice doll, which doll looks most like you? And I think that in all probability, we would still see the effects of the American propaganda machine. Halle Berry, is she a beautiful woman? If so, why? Is it because she has European features? she's, you know, she a white girl with a tan, or she a black woman who has African American features. And we have to a great degree been indoctrinated to what is right, what is good, and what is wrong. Now, what they're doing is, you know, they're getting empirical data and empirical studies, but the reality is this can be done on a much more base level. And we find that African Americans have many of the same biases, not to the same extent, but many of the same biases their white counterparts, unfortunately, 50 years after the march.
Okay, I'm gonna go over here to you, Henry.
With regard to implicit bias and sort of reducing those things, from a victim standpoint, from a person who is a victim of implicit biases, what can they do? Have you found that there's anything that they can do to reduce those biases?
I don't know of any empirical studies that have tested that, so I think, and because this is so new, I think that's certainly a step that we hope the research will go. I think the best thing that we can do as kind of consumers of the information, debias ourselves and then seek to debias others, is to use the tools. So if you feel that you are being perceived in a certain way or stereotyped in a certain way, then you could say, all right, well, this person can be debiased through individuating information, so I'm gonna help them by individuating. Now, you know, that's a choice that you have to make whether you do that. You know, think about women in math and science. There's all kinds of scenarios, but there's not as much empirical study of that, interestingly.
I'm kind of curious as to what you mean as being a victim. You mean you were racially profiled?
No, I'm not talking about myself.
I don't mean you, I mean a person.
Yes, someone who was
Trayvon Martin, was he racially profiled? Did Zimmerman get the benefit of the doubt that was afforded to him because he looked white with a predominantly white jury? Is this the kind of thing that judges should be instructing juries about? And in the Zimmerman case, they intentionally left race out of the equation, which arguably it should have been, but the judge made the decision. So is racism dead? Do we still have a need to debias judges and juries? As a defense attorney, I have gotten people off that I am convinced committed the act, on the one hand. But on the other hand, our system is set up to clothe all defendants with the presumption of innocence. And that presumption is intended to remain with them during the entire course of the proceeding unless or until their guilt is established beyond a reasonable doubt. Those are just words, of course. But the challenge, I think, is to recognize that bias exists, deal with it,